just want to start by asking a question. And it's not a rhetorical question, so some vague level of participation would make life better for me. Hands up if you've ever climbed a tree. Okay, a good number of you. Maybe a slightly better question then. Hands up who likes climbing trees, or maybe slightly better, liked, for those of us that have decided maybe it's less safe. Okay. And anyone here willing to confess to having never climbed a tree? My gosh, I expected no hands. You didn't put your hand up, did you? You've never climbed a tree? You have climbed a tree, okay. And so a few people haven't climbed trees, okay. So for many of us, growing up when we did meant that there wasn't a lot to do. Hands up if you grew up before the internet. Hands up if you remember before you could put a mobile phone in your pocket. Okay, so there's a general understanding going on here. Hands up if you didn't have access to a TV all of the time. Okay, so climbing trees is like a go-to for a load of us, right? Make all of this worse, and some of you grew up in the valleys, so you'll get this. I grew up in Cheddar. There is so little to do in Cheddar that doesn't involve trees, you would not believe. If we were bored, we climbed trees. If we were running away from someone, parents don't listen, we climbed trees. If we lost a football, we climbed a tree to see where it had gone. If we were trying to annoy someone by throwing things at them, we climbed a tree to get a better vantage point. You get the picture. There was very little that happened in my life growing up in Cheddar that didn't involve climbing trees. It was fun. Sometimes it was a necessity to avoid people catching you, but we loved it. The great thing about climbing trees is once you're up, it changes everything. It changes your vantage point. Everything seems more fun. You generally feel fairly invincible once you're up a tree. But coming down is a very different situation and story. Hands up if you've ever experienced trying to come down a tree that's been less successful. Okay, a few of you. Some of you have clearly mapped out your tree climbing well. Okay, so a whole load of people here have been to Hill House. So when we've done church weekends, that's where we go. Hands up if you remember the big tree by the swimming pool. I told you there's a lot of participation at the start of this. It dies down, don't worry. So when I was younger, my parents used to go to Hill House as officers. So they would be in charge of loads of young people, and that meant generally they paid less attention to me. I grew up in Cheddar. Hill House is surrounded by trees. I was in my element. So I would climb the tree by the swimming pool all of the time. But one evening I decided to push myself. So I climbed higher. And it was great fun, and I felt invincible, and I could see all of the tent field, and I was very happy until the moment when I needed to come down from the tree. Because the problem was I'd gone higher than I'd normally gone, and the way I'd got up was to do that thing where you push your back and your legs against opposing bits of tree to kind of shuffle up, and trying to get back to that position I wasn't going to do. I was stuck. I mean, like, I cried stuck, which isn't a cool look when you're trying to impress people older than you. And so I was above the reach of the average human being height, is probably fair to say. But fortunately at camp there was a young person there who was abnormally tall, a good friend of mine now, probably because he saved me from a tree, called John, and he plucked me out of the tree to safety. And he brought me down, and it becomes quite a fun story. But the truth is, once we're up a tree, things change. Things change. Everything about the way that we would conduct our lives on the ground changes a little bit being up a tree. So we're going to have a look at a character this morning, and we watched that amazing kids video, which I think really helps sometimes just to see it in a different light. But I'm going to ask Catherine if she'd come while I try and maneuver down a tree to share with us about Zacchaeus.
This morning's reading is from Luke chapter 19, verses 1 to 10. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he couldn't see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He's gone to be a guest in the house of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham." Amen. I was worried you wouldn't come down.
No, that's fine. I was expecting you to go up the tree to do the reading. Thank you, Catherine. So often when we read the story of Zacchaeus, we forget the tree part. It becomes a gesture of something that he does, and we quickly move past it. But something happens when Zacchaeus climbs the tree. Things happen when he climbs the tree, and I want us just to concentrate a little bit on that moment of what's going on as this man climbs the tree. Oh, that's not worked. I'll read it for you. "A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and he was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was a short man, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way." What do we know in this moment? What facts do we have before us? Well, we know that Zacchaeus was short. And we know that Jesus was coming. So we know that he climbed a tree to see him. That's what we know at this point. We know bits about Zacchaeus' life, but the 3 key components we know are Zacchaeus was short, Jesus was coming, so Zacchaeus climbed a tree to see him. This means we can conclude some other things. Zacchaeus didn't go and talk to Jesus. Zacchaeus didn't initiate a conversation with Jesus. He's gone to climb a tree to see him. He's not got his autograph book out to ask for a signature from this Jesus character. I think so often we decide that this encounter has been crafted, but all we know at this point is Zacchaeus wants to see Jesus. That's all he's doing. He's giving himself a vantage point. He's raising himself up to the point where he can see Jesus. He's not gone to reach out and touch the back of his cloak. It's just to see him. And yet this action leads to an incredible encounter. But that encounter comes in stages. 2 things happen, I believe, when he climbs the tree, and then a third thing happens over a meal. You see, the first thing that happens as Zacchaeus climbs this tree, when he puts himself up there, is he makes himself vulnerable. I know this because that ladder is above a baptistry, and I felt particularly vulnerable. But he was vulnerable. Any of you who have climbed a tree that begins to narrow at the top will know that it becomes less sturdy. Any of you that have climbed a tree and had friends shaking the tree at the bottom will know it is not a safe space to be. By simply making this move, known or unknown to Zacchaeus, he's become vulnerable. What do we know about him? Well, we know that he was a tax collector, not a popular character. In fact, being stuck up a tree may be a perfect opportunity for people to take their rotten fruit and throw it at him. He is vulnerable. He is completely defenseless in this moment. In fact, he's a little bit isolated. There's no quick escape for him. He's not able to defend himself. He is sat in his tree, vulnerable. Why? So that he could see Jesus. I find it fascinating that someone who we would know of, who is not seen as a popular character by anybody, would put himself in a situation where he is vulnerable to see Jesus. I wonder how many of us can relate to that feeling of vulnerability, of being in a situation, in a place where we don't feel completely in control, where we feel susceptible to the impact of the outside world. For some of us, it's situations we put ourselves in. Sometimes we choose decisions that will leave us vulnerable. Other times it's actions of other people that can leave us feeling very fragile, very exposed, defenseless. Suddenly this story of Zacchaeus isn't simply just about a short man climbing a tree. We can begin to see characteristics within our own lives coming through. I would imagine there is no one here that's never felt vulnerable, who's never felt like the odds are stacked against them, where they felt that they are in a place where they can do very little to help themselves, in need of someone else to be involved. Zacchaeus at this point can simply watch what is going on below him. Just as I found myself at Hill House all those years ago, vulnerable, I, and indeed Zacchaeus, was going to be in need of someone to impact his life. Something was going to change because he made himself vulnerable. I wonder if what we see in this moment is a glimpse into Zacchaeus' heart. All we know is he's a tax collector, he is short, Jesus was coming, so he climbed a tree. But I wonder if in this moment we begin to see something of Zacchaeus' heart. Because to climb the tree enhanced the fact that he was short. I am fairly sure there were jokes going around at the time about the fact he was short. It's just the way life is. So he'd made himself more vulnerable. Their jokes, their scorn, but something about Jesus made it worth taking the risk to be vulnerable. Something about all the stories he'd heard meant that it was worth climbing a tree to see Jesus. And I think in this moment we begin to see the heart of Zacchaeus isn't maybe as hard as some of us would have assumed. In fact, I think we see in this story a truth that we need to hear very clearly. We champion the wrong things too often. We champion strength. We champion those people that look like they've got it all together. Those decisive people. And yet here I believe we see something we should champion more. Vulnerability. A willingness to admit that he could not see Jesus without climbing a tree. A willingness to admit that he needed to be vulnerable. He couldn't have all the answers. He couldn't pay his way towards Jesus. He needed to be vulnerable. I wonder how many of us would do well to approach Jesus more vulnerably. Dare I say, come to chapel more vulnerably. More willing to admit that we are in need of a Saviour. More willing to admit that we are defenseless and helpless so often. Willing to say, I will put everything on the line for a glimpse of Jesus. It's what we see Zacchaeus doing here. All we know is that he's sure that Jesus is coming, and so therefore he climbs a tree. But I think any of us who have lived anything of life will know these actions are done with something deeper going on. Something deeper is happening. But something else happens. Something else happens as Zacchaeus climbs this tree. As I climbed, it's not a tree behind there, just to break the illusion, it's a ladder. I became more visible. By climbing a tree, you become more visible. As his head stuck out the top of this sycamore tree, he became more visible. Talk about exposing yourself. He's vulnerable, but now he's visible. Anyone who's remotely tall may be able to relate to this. I'm not hugely tall anymore, but growing up I was quite tall in my class. And so in school assemblies, when we were stood lined up to either kind of sit down or to leave, if someone talked, it didn't matter who it was, my name was called. Because I was the face that could be seen above the heads of all my friends. Has anyone else experienced that slight issue with being tall? It can't just be a me thing, yeah. So I taught myself from a young age, and you'll see it sometimes. If you see me stood with people, I kind of pop my hip out a little bit. I'm not making any statement. I'm just trying to be a little bit shorter for fear of someone calling my name to do things. It's the age-old thing on Zoom. When we were meeting on Zoom, and when we'd kind of ask if anyone had anything to share, everyone would look down. It was kind of like that, but for being tall. Because when we are tall, we are visible. People can see us. I wonder if I were to ask you, I'm not going to ask you to answer it, but I'm sure many of you have done that thing where you've been walking and doing some shopping and you've noticed someone really tall. And you kind of wait till you're a polite distance away from them before nudging the person you're with and being like, did you see how tall they were? And they're like, obviously, have you seen how tall they are? By climbing the tree, Zacchaeus has made himself visible. He is now visible. There is no chance of him hiding. Zacchaeus has gone up a tree to see Jesus, and yet by doing so has made himself both vulnerable and visible. Again, we don't know if he ever intended that to be the way, but I think we see a glimpse of his heart in the actions that he takes, because I know in my own life there are times when the last thing I want to do before Jesus is be vulnerable or visible. And yet we see a tax collector willing to be vulnerable and visible. You have to wonder if deep down he was willing to be seen, if something about him wanted to be seen by Jesus, to take that risk, to take that step. Again, a step that I think many of us would be wise to be taking. Coming before Jesus, vulnerable and visible. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. Zacchaeus is up a tree, visible to those, and as Jesus walks past, Jesus looks up and sees him. Jesus sees him. We could stop there. This man is nobody. Not popular, not desirable, rich, but probably with very few friends. And yet, as Jesus, Son of God, miracle maker and worker, this incredible teacher with his disciples and all this stuff going on, as Jesus walks past this absolute nobody, it is he who Jesus stops to see. Which means I can say with complete comfort to everyone here, Jesus sees you. Jesus sees you. An incredible moment. In fact, we see later on in the story, we won't touch on it, but we see by the response of all the other people present how bizarre it is that Jesus would pick Zacchaeus as the person that he would spend time with. Which makes me very comfortable to know that Jesus sees me if he saw Zacchaeus. He sees each and every one of us. I love the idea of what we see going on here. So much so is Zacchaeus' curiosity about Jesus that he climbs a tree. You know what the best thing is? There is a complete mix of people in this room. I know many of you. I don't know what your week's been like. Gosh, if your house was anything like ours this morning, I don't know what your Sunday morning was like. But we don't know why Zacchaeus climbed the tree beyond the fact he wanted to see Jesus. Maybe he wanted to see, is it possible that there is a man who is doing the kind of things that people are saying he is doing? Maybe it was just curiosity. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe he climbed that tree to say, you know what, this is a lie. This man is a fake, and I need to catch a glimpse of the person who is weaving this wonderful story and misleading all of these people. We don't know. All we know is Zacchaeus wanted to see Jesus. He was so curious, he was willing to make himself vulnerable and visible. Maybe Zacchaeus was up that tree thinking, is it possible that someone could turn water into wine? Because there is a money-making opportunity if ever he saw one. We don't know why Zacchaeus climbed the tree, what it was that he wanted to see of Jesus. Which again, I hope speaks to each of us. It doesn't matter exactly why we come before God. It matters that we come. We don't know why he climbed the tree, but what we do know is by making himself visible to Jesus, he is seen. He is seen. He's so curious, he's so interested in Jesus, he's willing to take away the safety of his own home, the safety of the ground, and climb a tree. I wonder when was the last time that we took a step that made us vulnerable and visible before God and said, God, see me, use me, forgive me, empower me. I don't know what it is. I don't know what the outcome of what you're seeking is. We don't know what Zacchaeus went into this expecting, but we do know this truth. Jesus saw him. Jesus saw him. I wonder if the challenge for those of us who have been in and around church for a long time is to hear this story not as this amazing children's story that we grew up with, but a very real challenge. When was the last time I genuinely came into a space, be it here, be it in your own prayer times, be it wherever, and just simply said before God, I am vulnerable and I am visible. See me. I don't know what it's going to mean. I don't know what the outcome is going to be. I've not come with all the answers. I've just simply come to see who you are again and allow you to impact my life. What would it mean for us to truly open ourselves up to God? To be willing to be seen by him? Because I love this part of the story and it really lends itself to the visuals. But the next bit is fascinating. In fact, the next bit is my favorite part of the story. I think all that we've talked about is crucial to understand who Zacchaeus is and what's happening here. But the next part is crucial. You'll be glad to know it is another V, because I'm trying to be a good Baptist and learn how to make 3 points all using the same letter. So me and Laura used a thesaurus. Not a thesaurus, that's the dinosaur. Thesaurus. Thesaurus to try and find the V that would work. By climbing the tree, Zacchaeus made himself vulnerable. He made himself visible. But the encounter with Jesus added value. You see, when Zacchaeus encounters Jesus personally, he finds that he's valued. Not because of all that he's gained of an earthly wealth, but because of who he is in the presence of Jesus. When Jesus reached that spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, he has gone to be a guest of a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. We have no idea what was said over that meal. We have no idea what the conversation was between Jesus and Zacchaeus that transformed this man's life. But we can take something from this encounter that I think is crucial for each of us. Jesus valued Zacchaeus so much that he was willing to have a personal encounter with him. The judgment of all the others meant Zacchaeus was never going to come into a place of religiosity. But Jesus is willing to have a personal encounter with him. And then Jesus does something which I think is incredibly powerful. I wonder if we're honest, how many of us wish Luke had given an account of that conversation. Because if Luke had written down what they talked about, we would have gone, brilliant, 8-week course. Here we go. Friends, let me take you from tax collector to generous person in 8 weeks. And please hear me, I have no issue with Alpha or anything, but if we knew what this conversation was, I promise you, by now, we would have packaged it as a church. But the problem is, for each of us, it works so differently when we encounter Jesus that there is no pre-made package. I don't know where you are, I don't know where you've come from, I don't know what you're facing, but what I do know is Jesus does. So he's going to meet you very differently to the way that maybe he's going to meet me. And he's going to journey with you very differently to the way that he might journey with me. If you're anything like me, Jesus is going to need to be very clear because you are very stubborn. But for others, you are gentle. And actually, you're just going to need that gentle journey with Jesus. I believe the reason we don't know the conversation between them is not because Luke is lazy. It's because it was for Jesus and Zacchaeus to have. Because Jesus valued Zacchaeus enough to give Zacchaeus his own time. This wasn't a grand teaching point. Jesus uses it, but it wasn't a grand teaching point. It was about a man. his relationship with Jesus. Remember the 99 sheep and the one that we're missing. I think in Zacchaeus we see something of that truth. Jesus has a crowd. People have turned out in their thousands, I'm guessing, I'm not good with history, to see him. So much so that a short man has to climb a tree to see him, and yet Jesus takes time out of that schedule to say, you and me, let's eat. Put the pen away, Luke. This is for me and Zacchaeus to have. All we have the privilege of knowing is that when we encounter Jesus in the way that Zacchaeus does, everything changes. Everything changes about his character, about the way he sees himself. No longer is his worth based in how much he can accumulate on earth. Suddenly his worth is all in Jesus, in who he is as a son of God. So much so that he's willing to give away not just what he's taken from people, but more. This will probably have left him nigh on broke. Everything he's ever accumulated. Can you imagine everything you've ever worked for? Those of you in professions where you've had to take exams and do things to get up the pay grade and achieve things, to go, you know what, all of that for Jesus I will just give up on. Here and now. Because that's not the way my life's going anymore. Friends, it is very dangerous to make yourself vulnerable to Jesus. Because when Zacchaeus climbed that tree, no longer did Jesus see a tax collector. And Jesus didn't see a short man. Jesus, when he looked at Zacchaeus, saw a child of God. And Jesus changed Zacchaeus' view from earthly things to heavenly things. So I wonder, as we've journeyed this story briefly this morning, where are you? My gosh, if I wanted to, I would love to take us on a journey through just that whole thing that's going on. Part of the crowd, just milling about. One of those who casts judgment on Jesus for spending time with a sinner. Maybe you wouldn't even leave your house for fear of being seen. For some of us, desperate for Jesus to see us, to feel valued, to feel loved, to feel like there is a way out of the situation we find ourselves in. I wonder where you are this morning. It's very easy for us to come to church and be fine. But very few of us are fine. Zacchaeus was wealthy beyond all imagination. Hated, but wealthy. It teaches us that the things the world values aren't the things that God values. Things that maybe make us great in the world can often cause us the most hurt. I wonder if there are people here who are vulnerable, who are worried, who know that behind the smiles on a Sunday morning there is something going on and you are acutely aware you can't fix it yourself. You need Jesus. You need to know that he has it under control. I wonder who here is feeling the need, maybe even trying to be seen, to be visible. Having spent so long feeling like everyone else gets all the opportunities, like God overlooks you. No matter how high a tree you climb, you always feel like he is passing beneath, not seeing you. I wonder if there's those of us present who know we need to shift our focus from earthly things to heavenly things. Changing the things that we place our value in. Beginning to understand the value that we have and how valued we are by God. My gosh, we know the verses. For many of us, we could recite them. But what would it mean for us to truly grasp, for God so loved me, that he sent his one and only son? God so loved Zacchaeus that he sent his one and only son. I wonder if this morning we need to just remember we are loved. Our value is not based in the things that the world sees. What does it mean when we read this story, not as that quirky Sunday school story that we love to tell and children make cool crafts of a little man climbing a tree, but we start to look at it and say, God, where do I fit into this? How can this speak into my life? Where am I? This story, I do believe, speaks into the lives of every single one of us. Doesn't matter how long we've been in church. Doesn't matter how secure we feel. Doesn't matter how new we are to this place. This is an encounter that I believe each of us can take something from. To know that we are seen. Please hear that. Jesus sees you. And if you're willing, and if you're vulnerable, he will encounter you. And I can promise you this, that encounter will change everything. Maybe not as we understand it. Maybe not in the ways that we would plan it. But that personal encounter with Jesus will change everything. Climbing trees is fun. But encountering Jesus is far better.